Hello, I'm Dr. Gerald Berke. I'm the chair of the NSDA Scientific Advisory Board, and I've been asked by the NSDA LA Support Group to discuss advances in spasmodic dysphonia research, and I'm quite honored to be able to speak with you today about that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the National Institute of Deafness and Other Communication Disorders and the way that they're approaching looking at funding grants currently. So the NIDCD mnemonic has developed four priority areas that they're interested in funding. That includes normal function, disease and disorders, diagnosis, treatment and prevention, and improving outcomes. Each priority has a list of research themes. So for example, normal function would include development, molecular and the microenvironment, homeostasis, etc. But some generic themes for improving outcome include better metrics for diagnosis and treatment, clinical trials, emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, prosthetics, comparative effectiveness of new treatments, and bioengineering advances. One can talk about low-hanging fruit, and those would include things that would be probably easier to get funded and are easier to get good data on. So that would include large database epidemiologic studies such as abstinence for smoking, or looking at HPV vaccination, human papillomavirus, better diagnostic and treatment metrics, or rehab studies such as voice and speech therapeutics. But then there are these advances on the horizon which could make huge progress if they bear fruit, and many of them are related to spasmodic dysphonia. They would include stem cell regeneration, genetic modification of inherited diseases, advances in neuroscience, including new procedures, prosthetics, new drugs, vaccines, and unrealized ways of caring for patients with some of these disorders. So what are some of the funding sources that can be used to advance research studies? So there are institutional grants. These are usually small grants. There are society grants that include like the American Academy of Otolaryngology, the Triologic Society, the American Laryngologic Society. There are foundation and industry grants. The NSDA is certainly a foundation grant. Industry grants can be useful, but you always have to be concerned about a conflict of interest that might exist when you're using the industry to fund some of your research. And then, of course, donors are an important source of research funding in the form of gifts or endowments. So research endowments from the NIDCD essentially divide into NIHK awards. These are young investigators, and not only do they have a research project that they're studying, but there's also a very large training component. They can be either basic science or clinically based. Sometimes institutions have block K grants as well. And then, of course, the classical R grants, which require usually a track record and preliminary data for that study. Funding levels usually, unfortunately, only end up being around 10 or 15% of the grants that are submitted. But if a particular grant is placed under special consideration, which can happen, then up to 30% of those grants can be funded. So the NIDCD has the option of really increasing a particular area. And I think spasmodic dysphonia has been successful in that regard for a while. So I wanted to first talk about a new paper that recently came out, and you can see that it was published in Neurology just this last year. by Dr. Simonian as the lead author on it. And this was from an NIH, NIDCD workshop on research priorities in spasmodic dysphonia. So the objective of the workshop was to delineate research priorities for improving clinical management of laryngeal dystonia. So the NIH convened a multidisciplinary panel of experts for a one-day workshop to examine current progress in understanding and etiology and clinical care. And the participants, which also included members from the NSDA, myself, and Charlie, and also Kim, reviewed terminology and discussed advances in understanding and pathophysiology. But the results also went on to say that its etiology remains unknown, whereas the pathophysiology likely involves large-scale functional and structural brain network disorganization. Current challenges include lack of clinically validated diagnostic markers and outcome measures, and the paucity of therapies that address the disorder pathophysiology. The conclusion of the workshop was that research priorities should be guided by challenges in clinical management of laryngeal dystonia. Identification of disorder-specific biomarkers would allow the development of novel diagnostic tools and unified measures of treatment outcome. Elucidation of the critical nodes within neural networks that cause or modulate the symptoms would allow the development of targeted therapies that address the underlying pathophysiology. Given the rarity of laryngeal dystonia, future rapid research progress may be facilitated by multi-center national and international collaborations. So a significant amount of money was recently given by the NIDCD to further some of these concepts, and I'll talk about that a little bit later in our discussion. So I wanted to go on to discuss the Scientific Advisory Board. It was created in 2007 and appointed Dr. Christy Ludlow, who was at the NIDCD for many years and is a really, really great researcher, as the first chair. And the Scientific Advisory Board is charged with reviewing grant applications, providing future directions for research, and fostering collaboration with researchers. The first meeting was held in 2008, included Dr. Ludlow, myself, Dr. Berke, Craig Evinger, who's a neuroscientist, Laurie Azelius, who's a really wonderful geneticist, and Carrie Tanner, who was a great epidemiologist. So several grant applications were reviewed, and a summary of the research priorities were published in 2008 and provided a basis for the NSDA research program. I was honored with being appointed the chair of the SAB in 2015 after Dr. Ludlow retired. So I'd like to discuss the NSDA NIH research portfolio, at this point. So I'd like to start off by talking about new treatments, because obviously that's what many of us are interested in, and I think these are exciting. To read you a quote by Dr. Honey, who's being supported by the NSDA. "We are all approaching the same problem with different techniques." So he is currently studying the impact of deep brain stimulation, DBS, on individuals with spasmodic dysphonia who have received this invasive brain surgery to treat other serious forms of dystonia or Parkinson's disease. If effective, this treatment would be used for the most extreme cases of SD, which are non-responsive to other treatments. Jürgen Konzak and a team at University of Minnesota are testing the effectiveness of vibrotactile stimulation among individuals with abductor SD. This non-invasive neuromodulation delivers directly stimulation to the larynx in the form of a collar around the neck. It's just vibratory stimulation. And this team has demonstrated that voice improvement using this technique on people with adductor SD can occur. Excitingly, Dr. Kimberly, Teresa Kimberly, that has been working with the NSDA, and Russell Banks, currently now at MGH, Massachusetts General, are investigating the effects of repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation, also called RTMS, on individuals with abductor spasmodic dysphonia. Prior research by this team has demonstrated improvement with this treatment on individuals with adductor SD, although a larger study and a more complete study is still in the works. And basically, this is performed by a coil that sits on the head to deliver RTMS for 20 minutes to the motor cortex of the brain. And this is done repeatedly over a period of time. And then they're currently reviewing to see how long the effects last for and how much benefit from this actually exists. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. In addition to that, there are some new measurement tools that are being looked at. So Dr. Rosen was recently funded, and he is exploring a possible new diagnostic tool, which may also help us to better understand how the vocal cords or vocal folds respond to stimuli. This grant also includes a training component to support a fourth-year medical student who is pursuing a dedicated research career in laryngology. At our institution, Dr. Mendelson, A.B. Mendelson, is participating in the development of an advanced computer-based program using artificial intelligence to create objective measures for outcomes of treatment. And this is done simply by video recordings and audio recordings of patients with spasmodic dysphonia. And the point of this grant is to see whether or not computer-based examination of just video images can determine the severity of dystonia. And the reason that this is important is for us to gain better knowledge of how patients are responding to treatment modalities and to compare treatments across medical centers. We need a good objective measure to study the severity in spasmodic dysphonia, and we currently don't have a simple way of doing that. And so this is an important adjuvant to our program. Along those same lines, Michael Pittman, who's at Columbia University, is conducting a multi-center study to validate a measurement tool called Communication Participation Item Bank, CPIB, and this scale would be used to quantify the severity of SD and response to treatment as well. So I'd like to talk about some of the studies that we've been reviewing and supporting that I think are important in terms of causation. Most of them are related to brain activity. And I'd like to discuss Dr. Teresa Kimberly here, you see first. Dr. Kimberly has been studying transmagnetic stimulation of the cortex using functional magnetic resonance imaging to evaluate brain function among individuals with abductor SD. And it is known that in the speech center that there are foci that not only are active in terms of setting forth the motor neurons that we use in speech, but there are also centers that inhibit this activity so that we get a nice graded response when we're communicating with one another. And it appears using some of these studies that the inhibitory centers that are in the brain, in the cortex, may not be functioning properly. And Dr. Kimberly's work has been studying these using functional magnetic imaging. Dr. Howd and his team at the University of California are using, he's an excellent researcher, and they've been using a very sophisticated magnetoencephalography, MEG, to observe neural activity during speech in people with SD. and those that have SD and tremor. And they have found some interesting and unexpected findings. Following voice onset, those somatosensory areas that feed into the cortical areas in the brain, we call them somatosensory because they take up sensory information when we're speaking, were more active in patients than controls, were more active in patients with spasmodic dysphonia. When they perturbed, when they changed the pitch heard by the subjects, when they vocalized, in other words, when they changed the somatosensory input, the researchers found that the brain areas responding to this perturbation were also more active in patients than controls. So this is consistent with their hypothesis that speakers with SD are hypersensitive to their sensory feedback, and somehow this contributes to the development of spasmodic dysphonia. And then Michael Hammer has been looking at this in a different way. He's actually takes puffs of air on the larynx of patients that are normals and with spasmodic dysphonia, and has found that the sensory feeling is associated with different types of changes in the brain interruptions that are experienced by individuals with spasmodic dysphonia. And then finally, there's a theory that shows that there are many nodes in the brain that seem to be functioning inappropriately in patients with spasmodic dysphonia, and that they tend to think of it, many researchers tend to think of it as a global type of discontinuity that's occurring, a global type of architecture that's not functioning properly. But using a different way of looking at these functional MRIs, Scott Norris and Evan Gordon at Washington University now believes that a lot of the thoughts about it being a global problem rather than a focal problem are maybe due to the way that the functional MRIs are being processed and not due to the actual brain problem itself. And so they've gone back and they've determined that in many of these more global potential issues, that there really were just focal issues. And the reason that that's important is because if it's a focal problem, then it will be much easier to manage and possibly cure than indeed if it's a focal area of the global area, of the brain that's functioning inappropriately. And so Scott Norris is also examining how dysfunctional individual brain networks are modified by botulinum toxin treatment in adductor spasmodic dysphonia using his more sophisticated technique. So I wanted to go over a little bit of the portfolio of the NSDA, going all the way back to 2009, so you can get a feel for what we have been supporting in some of our studies, many of which have led to NIH-funded research. In 2009, parametric analysis of pathology and treatment effect in spasmodic dysphonia. In 2010, we funded Rita Patel, who was looking at spatiotemporal disturbance of fine movements in adductor spasmodic dysphonia using pretty much high-speed filming to see how the vibrations of the larynx were occurring. And then 2012, Laurie Azelius, who I mentioned is just a wonderful geneticist looking at spasmodic dysphonia, was funded for studying identification of a spasmodic dysphonia gene using exome sequencing. Exome means the entire DNA. And this is a very difficult study because so many of the patients are sporadic and not familial. Familial forms are much easier to look at genetically than sporadic forms, which just occur randomly. 2015, Pathophysiology of Spasmodic Dysphonia a combined TMS and fMRI study by Teresa Kimberly that I just mentioned to you. And then a study by Michael Hammer that we funded in 2016, laryngeal somatosensory evocortical potentials in spasmodic dysphonia. 2017, there were 2 studies that were supported. The neurosurgical treatment of spasmodic dysphonia by Dr. Honey, as we mentioned, looking at neurosurgical approaches to deep brain stimulation. And then again, John Hood studying neural activity in spasmodic dysphonia, vocal tremor. In 2018, validation of communicative participation IDA-Bank as an outcome measure by Michael Pittman, an important study to try and look at severity. 2020, a wearable non-invasive neuromodulation technology for symptomatic treatment of spasmodic dysphonia by Jürgen Konzak. 2021, the first application, or one of the first applications of transcranial magnetic stimulation by Teresa Kimberly, studying its effect in terms of improving abductor laryngeal dystonia. And then recently, last year, development of a computerized video-based measure of severity for laryngeal dystonia by Dr. Mendelsohn at UCLA. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some other treatment studies that are ongoing and being funded by the NIH and other societies that I think are important that we discuss. So just recently, Dr. Simonian was awarded an 11.9 million NIH grant to lead a new multi-institutional center for neurological voice disorders, just in September of last year. This is a multi-institution study, and it's a P50 grant, which is a grant that provides administrative support to all these centers working together. And the new centers will include Mass Pioneer, the University of California, San Francisco, University of Utah, and included in this will be clinicians, scientists, neuroscience, otolaryngologists, speech-language pathologists, neurologists, neurosurgeons, and radiologists. And so this is an exciting and important grant that's been studied, and we're hoping that this multi-institutional group will be able to look at some of these problems more deeply than before. I wanted to talk about another grant that I think is being funded by the NIDCD. It's an R01, in which they've developed a brain-computer interface paradigm, which they believe might be helpful in patients with spasmodic dysphonia. And what this basically is patients will be developing this device that will connect their brain neurofeedback to sophisticated computer systems, such that when the brain is activated by optical or sensory input, patients can actually develop some way of biofeedbacking themselves to try and learn whether or not that they can actually control some of the factors which contribute to the development of spasmodic dysphonia. And they're currently actually asking for participants to work on this new study. It's a little like wearing some of the new types of head devices like Oculus makes, where you almost have 3D dimensional feedback in the metaverse, as they're now calling it, where you'll be able to feedback from brainwaves into this computer feedback system and see whether or not you can develop some way of actually controlling the brainwaves. And they've been able to do this, obviously, with some other types of disorders, patients with spinal cord injuries, et cetera. And so it does have some promise in that regard. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Dystonia Coalition. The overall goal of the Dystonia Coalition is to provide strong foundation essentials for the development of new treatments for isolated dystonia syndromes, known as primary dystonias or focal dystonias. These include cervical dystonia, blepharism, craniofacial dystonias, laryngeal dystonia, and some limb dystonias such as writer's cramp. And so the Dystonia Coalition certainly has several projects ongoing to study these. And one of the grants that the NSDA funded for Dr. Mendelsohn is in response to the proposal to try and develop techniques to study the severity of these various dystonias. And then finally, two other projects which are at work. Dr. Simonian, along with her colleagues, have developed a platform called DystoniaNet that diagnoses dystonia with very high accuracy in a very short period of time using really high resolution MRIs. And whether or not this will actually become a useful platform is really dependent upon whether or not they will be able to use this on MRIs sent from various centers around the country. The other issue with that is that it seems to be, as I alluded to, much more sensitive using familial forms of dystonia rather than sporadic forms, which are much more common. And then finally, there's some phase 2-3 clinical trials at Mass Eye and Ear using a new oral drug, sodium oxybate, for the treatment of laryngeal dystonia and vocal tremors in patients that seem to be alcohol sensitive to their disorder. Sodium oxybate has to be licensed under strict regulations because it is habit forming, and it really only lasts about 3 hours once it's taken. So I'm not sure that it'll ever get beyond being kind of a Cinderella drug for this problem, but nevertheless, it is in 2 second and third phase clinical trials. So that's really all I had to report to you at this time. There's a lot of exciting work going on. There's a lot of researchers in this field for a rare dystonia, for a rare disease. Spasmodic dysphonia is getting a tremendous amount of attention from the NIH. And this is a photo of us that was taken at one of our NSDA conferences. Dr. Ozelius, myself, Dr. Berke, Dr. Simonian, Christopher Honey, Kimberly, and Michael Pittman. I'm very excited to present this data to you. Thank you very much for your attention.